They blew up my great-grandfather's dam at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, while I was just grabbing coffee. By the time I screeched into the driveway, 100 years of hand-cut limestone lay in smoking ruins, and there stood HOA President Dexter Hawthorne, grinning like he'd won the lottery, brushing dust off his stupid polo shirt. "Free demolition," he smirked. "Your little swamp was killing our property values." What this idiot didn't realize? That swamp had held back floodwater for the entire neighborhood since 1924. He'd just pulled the plug on a ticking time bomb. With spring snowmelt only 6 weeks away, the sharp stink of explosives still hung in the air as Dexter snapped victory selfies, completely oblivious that he'd turned his 800K McMansion into future lakefront property. Old Testament style. What would you do if someone destroyed your family's legacy, then posted smug selfies about it? Drop your worst HOA horror story in the comments. This one's about to go full biblical. My name's Ezra Blackwood, and I'm a hydraulic engineer who thought inheriting 12 acres in Colorado would be the fresh start I needed after my divorce went nuclear. What I got instead was a front row seat to small-town corruption that would make a Chicago alderman blush. The property sits upstream from Millbrook Estates, one of those cookie-cutter developments where every McMansion looks like it was squeezed from the same beige tube. My great-grandfather, Samuel Blackwood, built our stone dam back in 1924 during the Depression, when men knew how to work with their hands and didn't need environmental impact studies to move a rock. That dam created a 3-acre pond that's been the heart of our land for a century. Morning mist rises off the water like ghosts, and you can hear the gentle tumble of water over hand-cut limestone worn smooth as river stones. The smell of wet earth and cattails hits you at dawn. Pure Rocky Mountain peace, mixed with the metallic taste of thin mountain air. I'd moved back to start a sustainable aquaculture business, raising trout and growing organic vegetables using the pond's natural irrigation. Simple plan: heal from my marriage disaster while honoring my grandfather's legacy and maybe making enough money to forget my ex-wife ever existed. Funny thing about fresh starts, they have a way of attracting fresh disasters. Enter Dexter Hawthorne. Picture a guy who drives a BMW X7 but calls it a Beamer, like he's still trying to impress high school girls. 52 years old, real estate developer, HOA president for 8 consecutive years, the kind of man who wears pressed khakis to neighborhood barbecues and thinks rustic charm translates to property value cancer. Dexter had big plans for Millbrook Estates, transforming our quiet valley into some upscale resort community with golf courses and spa facilities. My hillbilly fish pond, as he so eloquently put it, didn't fit his vision of manicured perfection where every blade of grass knew its place and stayed there. The attack came via certified letter on a Thursday morning, thick as a phone book and twice as threatening. Notice of unpaid assessments and immediate compliance demand. According to Dexter's legal dream team, I owed $12,000 in back HOA fees for community water management services. Services I'd never requested, never received, never agreed to pay for. Oh, and my dam? That was an unauthorized structure violating community standards. Remove it within 30 days or face $500 daily fines. 12 grand in fabricated fees, plus $500 a day until I destroyed my family's century-old engineering. For a dam that had been protecting their neighborhood since Warren G. Harding was president. I called Dexter directly, thinking we could handle this like reasonable adults. "Listen," I said, "my family never joined your HOA. This property predates your community by 70 years. His laugh sounded like a garbage disposal grinding beer bottles. "Doesn't matter, Ezra. Water flows through our community, so you're using community resources. Pay what you owe or tear down that eyesore." The morning coffee in my mouth turned bitter as his real motivation crystallized. "Your little swamp is dragging down everyone's property values," he continued. "We've got standards here. Maybe you should consider selling to someone who understands what civilization looks like." The crunch of gravel under his BMW's tires as he drove away told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about fees, regulations, or community standards. This was about power, and Dexter wanted my land for his development schemes. I hired a lawyer that afternoon and discovered something beautiful. My grandfather had specifically refused HOA membership when it formed in 1954, and the original property boundaries were legally ambiguous. County records showed conflicting surveys. We had a solid case. But Dexter wasn't interested in playing by legal rules. Within a week, county inspectors started appearing like biblical locusts, citing anonymous complaints about everything from fence heights to mailbox colors to the alleged sound of my morning coffee grinder disturbing the peace. Safety inspections designed to harass me into submission and bankruptcy through legal fees. He'd just made one critical miscalculation. You don't pick a bureaucratic fight with someone who designs water systems for a living, especially when you live downstream from his dam. Dexter's first real power play came 3 weeks later when his golf buddy from the county showed up at my door with a clipboard and an attitude. "Rick Morrison, county building inspector," he announced, not bothering to make eye contact. "Got reports your dam's structurally unsound. Need to do an emergency assessment." I watched this clown spend 20 minutes poking at century-old stonework with a screwdriver like he was checking a used car's rust spots. The metallic ping of his tool against limestone echoed across the water while he scribbled notes, never measuring anything, never photographing the foundation, just occasionally grunting disapprovingly for show. His assessment arrived by courier the next morning. Immediate demolition required due to catastrophic structural failure risk. Here's where things got interesting. The report claimed my dam showed severe foundation erosion typical of 1960s concrete construction. I nearly choked on my coffee reading that line. My great-grandfather had built this beauty with hand-cut limestone blocks in 1924, 24 years before concrete was even used for residential dams in Colorado. Morrison had never actually examined my dam. He'd filed a completely fabricated report without setting foot on the actual structure. Time for some engineering education. I hired Matthews & Associates, the structural firm that had certified half the bridges in Colorado, for an independent assessment. Cost me $3,000 I didn't have, but their 40-page report was worth every penny. The lead engineer spent 6 hours crawling over every stone, measuring water flow, testing mortar joints with equipment that cost more than my truck. "Dam exceeds current safety standards by 200%, their summary read. Original 1924 construction superior to modern requirements. Estimated lifespan 500+ years with normal maintenance." 500 years. My great-grandfather had built something that would outlast the Roman Empire. Now, I remembered reading somewhere that when officials falsify emergency reports, they become personally liable for any damages their lies cause. Morrison had just painted a giant legal target on his back, and I had the ammunition to hit it. I filed a formal complaint with the State Engineering Board, complete with photographic evidence showing Morrison's inspection never touched the actual foundation. Then I sent copies to the county prosecutor, the local newspaper, and Morrison's own supervisor. The smell of fresh printed evidence packets filled my kitchen as I prepared for bureaucratic war. Turns out most states let you demand a second opinion on any emergency demolition order. And if their first assessment was fraudulent, the county has to pay for your independent report plus damages, something they probably should have mentioned in civics class. While I was building my legal case, Dexter launched his media campaign. "Dangerous dam threatens community safety," screamed the Millbrook Herald's front page. Anonymous neighbors expressed grave concerns about the aging structure that could collapse at any moment and flood dozens of homes. Pure fiction, but effective fiction. Dexter organized a concerned citizens petition drive, going door to door with professionally printed flyers showing stock photos of actual dam failures from other states. The sound of his leather shoes clicking on concrete sidewalks became the soundtrack of my daily harassment. "Would you want this ticking time bomb in your backyard?" he'd ask, pointing at photos of disasters that had nothing to do with my property. 57 neighbors signed his petition demanding immediate removal of my hazardous structure. Time for some community education. I invited every petition signer to tour my property and see the actual dam, not Dexter's scare tactic photos. 23 showed up on a Saturday morning, and I walked them through the engineering basics using terms they could understand. "See how the water flows over the spillway?" I explained, running my hand along the smooth limestone. "That controlled release prevents flooding. Remove this dam, and all that water hits your neighborhood at once during spring runoff." The texture of century-old stonework under my fingers, still solid, still precise, still doing exactly what my great-grandfather designed it to do, told the real story better than any technical report. By noon, 18 of those 23 neighbors had crossed their names off Dexter's petition. But Dexter wasn't done playing dirty. County demolition trucks appeared in my driveway Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., despite my pending legal appeals. Orange-vested workers started unloading equipment while the crew chief waved Morrison's bogus emergency order like a magic wand. I blocked the access road with my pickup truck and called every lawyer, reporter, and county official in my phone. "You're interfering with public safety," the crew chief shouted over the diesel rumble of his equipment. "I'm preventing destruction of private property based on fraudulent paperwork," I shouted back. 20 minutes later, Dexter arrived with 2 sheriff's deputies claiming I was threatening public safety by obstructing emergency services. He'd finally overplayed his hand. Local TV news crews don't usually cover routine demolitions, but they sure as hell show up when police get called to property disputes involving corruption allegations. Channel 9's cameras caught every word as Dexter tried to explain why a dangerous dam had been standing safely for 99 years, but suddenly needed emergency demolition the day after my lawyer filed corruption charges against his inspector buddy. His first tactical mistake: going on camera while angry makes you look guilty, even when you're telling the truth. The news coverage had barely died down when Dexter pulled out his next trick: buying politicians. City Councilman Bradley Walsh, another golf buddy because apparently Dexter collected corrupt officials like some people collect stamps, suddenly developed passionate concerns about pre-1950 water retention structures and their environmental impact on modern communities. Walsh introduced Emergency Ordinance 847 at Thursday's City Council meeting, claiming stagnant water from aging dams was breeding mosquitoes and threatening public health. The ordinance specifically targeted water structures built before 1950, which meant exactly one thing in our county: my dam. I sat in the back of that stuffy municipal building, breathing recycled air that tasted like old coffee and broken dreams, watching Dexter's puppet show unfold with the kind of shameless coordination you'd expect from a community theater production. "We must prioritize community health over individual property rights," Walsh declared, reading from notes that probably came straight from Dexter's legal team. But here's where Dexter's arrogance bit him square in the ass. During the public comment period, I stood up and asked one beautifully simple question. "Councilman Walsh, can you name any other pre-1950 water retention structures in our jurisdiction that this ordinance would affect?" Dead silence. The man literally shuffled his papers for 30 seconds. You could hear every rustle echoing off the cheap acoustic tiles, before mumbling something about comprehensive community planning. That's when I dropped the bomb I'd been preparing for 2 weeks. I'd spent my evenings digging through public records like a forensic accountant on a cocaine bender. Property deeds, development permits, corporate filings, following the money trail that led straight back to our HOA president's secret empire. "Council members," I said, pulling out a folder thick enough to choke a draft horse, "I'd like to present evidence that the primary beneficiary of this ordinance owns 47% of the upstream parcels through various LLCs and has filed preliminary development plans for a $12 million resort community." The crackle of paper in that dead quiet room sounded like gunfire in a library. Here's the beautiful part. Dexter's development plan required removing my dam to build artificial golf course water features that he would control. He'd been lying about environmental concerns while planning to replace natural flood protection with decorative ponds for rich people to admire between martinis. You could literally watch the blood drain from Dexter's face as I read from his own development documents. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land while his carefully constructed environmental narrative crumbled in real time. His grand plan wasn't about community safety or property values. He wanted to tear down a century of flood protection so he could build fake lakes for tourists to Instagram while they pretended to golf. The council postponed their vote pending further environmental review, which was political speak for "holy shit, we almost got caught helping with obvious corruption." But Dexter was nothing if not persistent, like a tick that's found a particularly juicy vein. The next week brought a parade of bought and paid for experts claiming my stagnant pond was an ecological disaster waiting to happen. A water quality specialist who'd never set foot on my property testified that my dam was creating anaerobic dead zones that killed fish. This was particularly hilarious since my pond supported a thriving trout population I'd been documenting for months. The taste of fresh-caught rainbow trout from my supposedly dead water made their testimony even more ridiculous. I countered by inviting the state environmental agency to conduct their own assessment. Their biologists spent 3 days cataloging the wildlife my pond supported. 24 fish species, countless aquatic insects, nesting waterfowl, and a family of beavers who'd moved in upstream. This is one of the healthiest freshwater ecosystems we've surveyed in the region, their report concluded. Removing this structure would constitute significant environmental damage. Suddenly, Dexter's environmental angle collapsed faster than his fake concern for community welfare. That's when the real dirty tricks started. Someone, and I think we can all guess who, filed anonymous complaints with the EPA claiming I was illegally diverting water from a protected watershed. Federal investigators don't mess around with environmental violations, so I spent 3 weeks documenting every drop of water that flowed through my property. The EPA inspector turned out to be a straight shooter who actually read the historical records I provided. Turns out my great-grandfather's 1924 permits were still valid, still legal, still protected under grandfather clauses that Dexter's expensive lawyers had apparently never heard of. Mr. Blackwood, the inspector told me while standing on my dam listening to the gentle splash of water over limestone, your family has maintained this water system exactly as permitted for nearly a century. Anyone trying to force its removal without federal approval would be violating the Clean Water Act. I'd learned from a civil engineer buddy that when someone tries to force you to violate existing environmental permits, you can sue them for federal law violations. The penalties run about $50,000 per day, which would make even Dexter's development budget break out in a cold sweat. Meanwhile, the harassment campaign intensified. Private investigators started following me to the grocery store. My mailbox got accidentally destroyed by the snowplow 3 times in 2 weeks. Someone kept reporting my truck as abandoned whenever I parked in town for longer than an hour. But Dexter had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated how much his own neighbors were starting to hate him. The HOA's next monthly meeting turned into an open revolt when homeowners started asking uncomfortable questions about where their dues had been going. Turns out, when you piss off engineers and accountants, they start auditing your books with the thoroughness of IRS agents. Explain this $18,000 payment to Hawthorne Consulting, demanded Janet Morrison, no relation to the corrupt inspector. That's your own company, Dexter. The meeting dissolved into chaos as 3 years of financial irregularities came tumbling out like dirty laundry from a broken washing machine. Dexter fled before the vote of no confidence, but not before someone recorded him screaming that ungrateful neighbors didn't deserve his leadership. His second tactical mistake: never insult people who pay your salary, especially when they're already suspicious of your expense account and have started taking notes. The HOA revolt should have been Dexter's wake-up call to back down gracefully. Instead, he decided to go nuclear, because apparently when you're already digging yourself into a hole, the logical next step is dynamite. 2 days after fleeing his own board meeting like a teenager caught with Dad's car, Dexter filed papers claiming eminent domain authority to seize my dam property for public safety. According to his emergency petition, the HOA had inherent water management jurisdiction that superseded individual property rights. The legal paperwork looked official enough to fool a casual observer, complete with forged county seals and backdated environmental assessments. Dexter had rushed this through during the July 4th weekend when most officials were at barbecues instead of their offices, probably assuming nobody would notice until it was too late. I was grilling burgers on my back deck, enjoying the smell of charcoal smoke mixing with mountain air and the eternal sound of water tumbling over limestone, when my lawyer called with the bad news. They've scheduled an emergency city council vote for tomorrow morning, she said, 9 a.m. while most people are still in holiday food comas. But while Dexter was busy forging documents and bribing officials, I'd been doing some forensic accounting that would make the FBI proud. 3 years of HOA financial records had revealed something beautiful. Dexter had been embezzling community funds to finance his development scheme, using legal consulting fees and emergency maintenance contracts to pay his own companies nearly $180,000. The evidence was gorgeous in its simplicity. Inflated landscaping contracts to his brother-in-law's company that charged $300 per hour to mow grass that volunteers had already cut for free. Legal consulting fees paid to Mountain West Advisory, a shell corporation that existed only on paper and happened to share Dexter's business address. Maintenance contracts with companies that had no employees, no equipment, and no purpose except funneling HOA money into Dexter's personal accounts. I'd learned something fascinating from my forensic accountant neighbor. In Colorado, HOA financial records are public documents that any homeowner can request within 10 business days. Most people never bother asking, which is exactly what corrupt board members count on for their retirement planning. Dexter had been running a textbook embezzlement scheme, stealing homeowner dues to fund his private development projects. Every payment was documented, every fake invoice was preserved in the HOA's own files, every forged signature was photographed and time-stamped. The smell of fresh printer ink and righteous anger filled my kitchen as I prepared evidence packets for every homeowner in Millbrook Estates. I called an emergency HOA meeting for Sunday evening, the night before Dexter's secret city council vote. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. 150 angry homeowners demanding answers about their missing money and their rogue president's latest power grab. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, standing at the front of that packed room while the taste of impending justice filled my mouth, "I have 3 years of financial records showing exactly where your HOA dues have been going." The sound of rustling paper filled the silence as people opened their evidence packets. You could literally watch the realization dawn on their faces. Their community fund hadn't been funding community improvements. It had been funding Dexter's personal real estate empire. "This $15,000 payment to Hawthorne Landscaping," I continued, pointing to a highlighted invoice. "That's Dexter's brother-in-law's company. They charged you $300 per hour to mow grass that volunteers had already cut for free." Gasps turned to angry murmurs as the crowd discovered payment after payment to Dexter-connected companies. This $25,000 emergency legal consulting fee went to Mountain West Advisory, a company that exists only at Dexter's business address and has never provided any legal services to this community. By the time I finished presenting 18 months of systematic theft, the crowd was ready for blood. Janet Morrison stood up and formally moved to remove Dexter from all HOA positions, freeze all financial accounts, and file criminal charges for embezzlement. The vote was unanimous, 150-0. Even Dexter's former allies had abandoned ship once they saw their own money being stolen. But Dexter wasn't done fighting dirty. Apparently, when you're already facing embezzlement charges, what's a little illegal demolition between friends? Monday morning's city council meeting turned into a 3-ring circus when Dexter arrived with his lawyer, claiming the HOA vote was illegitimate and demanding the eminent domain seizure proceed as planned. He'd apparently convinced himself that brazening it out was still possible, like a poker player doubling down with a pair of twos. "The safety of our community cannot be held hostage by one man's refusal to accept reasonable regulations," he declared, still playing the public safety card while completely ignoring that his own neighbors had just fired him for theft. That's when I played my ace card. "Council members," I said, standing up from the gallery with a folder full of evidence, "I'd like the record to reflect that the person requesting this eminent domain action has just been removed from office for embezzling community funds and is currently under criminal investigation for fraud." I handed the city clerk a copy of Sunday night's HOA resolution, along with financial evidence showing $180,000 in documented theft. "Furthermore," I continued, "the legal authority, Mr. Hawthorne claims to represent the Millbrook Estates HOA, has formally voted to oppose this seizure and support preservation of the dam." You could watch Dexter's lawyer physically distance himself from his client as the implications sank in. Even corrupt politicians won't touch someone actively being investigated for embezzlement. Bad for their own legal health and campaign contributions. The council voted 7-0 to table Dexter's petition, pending resolution of criminal matters. But the sweet taste of victory turned bitter when I realized Dexter's final desperate move. Rather than accept defeat gracefully, he decided to take his revenge directly. If he couldn't steal my land legally, he'd destroy it illegally and deal with the consequences later. The strategy of a man who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. County demolition crews appeared at my gate Thursday morning with orders to begin emergency demolition based on Morrison's original fake safety report. The crew chief waived that fraudulent assessment like it was still valid, even though the state engineering board had formally revoked it 3 days earlier. "This is an illegal demolition," I told him, standing between his excavator and my dam. "Take it up with the county," he replied with a shrug. "I got orders to remove a dangerous structure." The rumble of diesel engines filled the morning air as 20 tons of demolition equipment prepared to erase a century of my family's engineering. And somewhere behind the legal smokescreen I knew Dexter was watching and waiting, counting on bureaucratic confusion to let him destroy what he couldn't steal. Time for the nuclear option. If Dexter wanted to play outside the law, I'd make sure the whole world was watching when physics taught him why my great-grandfather's engineering had lasted 100 years. Standing there watching demolition equipment position itself to destroy my family's legacy, I did something desperate. I called my grandfather's old lawyer. Harold Brighton had been 93 for the past 5 years, according to him, and his memory for details made most computers look forgetful. If anyone knew the legal secrets buried in my family's century-old property rights, it would be Harold. Ezra, his voice crackled through my phone while diesel engines rumbled in the background. You need to get to my office right now. There's something in your great-grandfather's papers that changes everything. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Harold's dusty law office watching him pull a manila folder from a file cabinet that probably predated television. Your great-grandfather was smarter than anyone realized, Harold said, spreading yellow documents across his oak desk. Look at this. And the document was dated 1953, a legal agreement between Samuel Blackwood and the newly formed Millbrook County Water District. My hands trembled as I read the archaic legal language, but Harold translated the important parts. Your family didn't just build a dam for their own property, he explained. They entered into a perpetual flood control contract with the county. You're legally responsible for maintaining downstream flow management, and you have the authority to protect that infrastructure from interference. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth as the implications hit me. Wait, I said. You're telling me that removing my dam would violate a legally binding flood control contract? Harold's grin reminded me why he'd never lost a property rights case in 60 years of practice. Better than that, son. If anyone forces you to breach this contract and flooding occurs, they're liable for every penny of damage, plus federal penalties for interfering with authorized flood control infrastructure. I stared at the 1953 agreement, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night. My great-grandfather hadn't just built a dam to create a pond. He'd engineered a flood control system and gotten the county to legally recognize his family as responsible for protecting everyone downstream. Harold, I said slowly, what happens if someone destroys authorized flood control infrastructure right before spring snowmelt season? His laugh sounded like autumn leaves rustling. Well, that would be criminally negligent destruction of public safety infrastructure. Federal charges, personal liability, and enough legal exposure to bankrupt a small country. The sound of heavy machinery positioning outside my property took on a completely different meaning. Dexter wasn't just destroying my family's dam. He was about to commit a federal crime that would make him personally responsible for protecting every house in his neighborhood. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Harold, I need you to explain this flood control contract on camera because I think we're about to witness the most expensive mistake in Colorado legal history. Harold straightened his tie and looked directly into my phone's camera. The 1953 Millbrook Flood Control Compact makes the Blackwood family responsible for maintaining water flow management for the entire downstream watershed. Any interference with this authorized infrastructure constitutes a federal violation of public safety protocols. Outside, I could hear the demolition crew setting charges. Furthermore, Harold continued, spring snowmelt season traditionally produces the highest water volumes of the year. Destroying flood control infrastructure during peak flood season would constitute gross negligence under both state and federal law. I checked the weather forecast on my phone. The National Weather Service was predicting the largest spring snowmelt in a decade, starting in less than 6 weeks. Colorado's snowpack was 140% above normal after a brutal winter, and the warming trend was accelerating. Harold, I said, pieces clicking into place. Dexter's neighborhood sits in the original floodplain, doesn't it? Son, without your family's dam, that entire development would flood annually. Has been flooding for thousands of years. That's why your great-grandfather built the dam in the first place. The crunch of boots on gravel announced the demolition foreman approaching my house. Through the window, I could see him checking his watch and signaling his crew. I had maybe 10 minutes before they started blasting. Harold, can you get an emergency injunction based on this flood control contract? Already calling the judge, he said, reaching for his ancient rotary phone. But son, even if we stop them today, they'll be back tomorrow with different paperwork. You need to make this public. Let everyone know what's really at stake. That's when the brilliant, terrible idea hit me. What if I didn't stop the demolition? What if I let Dexter destroy the dam, documented everything for legal liability, and then watched physics teach him why flood control engineering isn't optional? the smell of explosive charges being positioned outside mixed with the musty scent of old legal documents as I made the hardest decision of my life. I could save my neighbors from flooding, or I could let them learn the hard way that some infrastructure exists for reasons bigger than property values and community aesthetics. Either way, Dexter had just made himself personally responsible for protecting every house downstream from his own stupidity. Harold's emergency injunction bought me 48 hours, but I knew Dexter would find a way around it. Time to get serious about documentation and disaster preparation. My first call went to Dr. Sarah Martinez at Colorado State's Hydrology Department. Professor Martinez, this is Ezra Blackwood. I need a favor that's going to sound insane, but I promise it's legitimate. Try me, she said. I need computer modeling for what happens when a century-old flood control dam gets destroyed 6 weeks before the biggest spring snowmelt in a decade. 3 hours later, I was driving to Fort Collins with a hard drive full of survey data, historical flow measurements, and current weather projections. Dr. Martinez's graduate students needed a real-world project for their flood modeling thesis, and I was about to give them the disaster scenario of a lifetime. This is fascinating, Dr. Martinez said, reviewing my great-grandfather's 1924 engineering notes. Your ancestor was using techniques that we didn't formally recognize until the 1970s. He basically invented modern watershed management by accident. Her students spent 2 weeks building computer simulations that would make Noah jealous. The results were terrifying and beautiful. Without my dam, spring snowmelt would turn Millbrook Estates into a temporary lake that covered 47 houses and lasted 3 to 4 weeks. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Martinez said, showing me color-coded flood maps, this isn't just flooding. This is a relocation event. Some of these houses would be underwater for a month. I learned something valuable about disaster preparation. Universities love real-world projects, and graduate students work for pizza and academic credit. My $200 investment in computer modeling would have cost $50,000 from a private consulting firm. Next, I needed legal armor. My second call went to Rebecca Torres, an environmental lawyer who specialized in federal water rights violations. She drove down from Denver after I faxed her Harold's 1953 flood control contract. Ezra, this document is legal dynamite, she said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. If someone destroys authorized flood control infrastructure and people get hurt, they face personal liability that insurance won't cover. She explained something I hadn't considered. When officials act outside their legal authority, they lose qualified immunity and become personally responsible for damages. Dexter's eminent domain claim was fraudulent, Morrison's safety assessment was fabricated, and the demolition order violated federal law. Anyone who destroys your dam will be personally liable for every flooded basement, every displaced family, every dollar of property damage, Rebecca explained. We're talking about potential liability in the tens of millions. A time for community organizing. I created the Millbrook Safety Coalition with Janet Morrison and 2 other former HOA board members who'd gotten tired of Dexter's corruption. Our mission was simple: educate neighbors about flood risk and give them tools to protect themselves. Our first flyer was brutal in its simplicity. Your house will flood, a scientific analysis of spring snowmelt without dam protection. We included Dr. Martinez's flood map showing exactly which addresses would be underwater and for how long. The smell of fresh printed disaster maps filled my garage as we prepared for the biggest door-to-door education campaign in Millbrook's history. Going house to house taught me something about human psychology. Most people ignore disaster warnings until you show them their specific address on a flood map. But once they see their own house colored bright blue under 6 feet of water, they pay attention fast. Mrs. Patterson, I said, showing her the computer simulation, your house sits in what used to be the creek's natural overflow channel. Without the dam, you'll have 3 feet of water in your living room for about 2 weeks. She stared at the map like it was a cancer diagnosis. What can I do? She asked. Help us organize a town hall meeting where everyone can see the science, hear the legal implications, and decide whether Dexter's development project is worth losing your house. I learned that emergency management officials love having local experts who understand their territory. Fire Chief Rodriguez had been worried about spring flooding for months, but didn't have the engineering background to quantify the risk. Ezra, can you set up a flood monitoring system? He asked. If this dam gets destroyed, we'll need early warning for evacuation. I spent a weekend installing water level sensors throughout the creek system, connected to a text alert network that could warn every downstream resident when flooding started. The hardware cost $800 and could save millions in property damage. For the legal strategy, Rebecca helped me prepare criminal referral packages for state and federal prosecutors. Every fraudulent document, every illegal payment, every violation of environmental law, all organized into prosecutable cases with evidence that would make prosecutors salivate. The beauty of white-collar crime, Rebecca explained, is that criminals always create their own evidence. Dexter's been documenting his own corruption for 3 years. My media strategy was simple: make the story too big for local officials to ignore. I contacted Sarah Brighton, an investigative reporter from Denver who specialized in government corruption stories. "Sarah, I've got a story about HOA corruption, environmental crime, and an impending flood disaster that could displace dozens of families." She drove down the next day with a camera crew, but my secret weapon was physics itself. I didn't need to destroy Dexter, I just needed to let him destroy himself while the whole world watched. Spring snowmelt doesn't care about politics, corruption, or property values. Water follows gravity, period. The trap was simple: document everything, warn everyone, prepare for disaster, and let Dexter face the consequences of fighting a century of engineering with a clipboard and an attitude. By the time I finished my preparations, I had legal documentation that would put Dexter in federal prison, scientific evidence that would make him liable for millions in flood damage, and community support that would make him a pariah in his own neighborhood. All I had to do was let him demolish my dam and watch physics send him the bill. Dexter's response to the injunction was predictably desperate. He decided to destroy the evidence before anyone could use it against him. I discovered this when Janet Morrison called me at midnight, whispering like she was reporting a burglary in progress. "Ezra, Dexter's at the HOA office right now with a paper shredder and 3 boxes of financial records." I threw on clothes and drove to the community center, where I found Dexter's BMW parked under a broken streetlight like he was conducting a drug deal. The sound of an industrial shredder echoed through the building's thin walls. Smart criminals destroy evidence quietly. Desperate criminals make noise and leave witnesses. I started recording on my phone and called the police non-emergency line. "This is Ezra Blackwood reporting destruction of evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation," I said, loud enough for my voice to carry across the parking lot. 20 minutes later, Deputy Maria Santos arrived to find Dexter standing in a mountain of shredded HOA financial records, claiming he was updating filing systems. "At midnight?" Deputy Santos asked, shining her flashlight on the evidence confetti. "Community business doesn't follow business hours," Dexter replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. What Dexter didn't know was that Rebecca Torres had already subpoenaed the HOA's bank records directly from the credit union. His frantic shredding party was destroying copies while the originals sat safely in a federal prosecutor's office. The next morning brought Dexter's most pathetic power play yet. He tried to have my property condemned for public health violations. County Health Inspector Linda Walsh, apparently Dexter collected corrupt officials from the same family tree, arrived with complaints about standing water breeding mosquitoes and unsanitary conditions threatening community health. I watched her spend 5 minutes pretending to inspect my crystal-clear pond before declaring it a public health hazard requiring immediate remediation. Her report claimed my pond contained dangerous bacteria levels and toxic algae blooms, based on water samples she'd never taken from a location she'd barely examined. The irony was delicious. My pond was cleaner than most municipal water supplies, thanks to the natural filtration system my great-grandfather had engineered with limestone and native aquatic plants. Time for some scientific embarrassment. I called Dr. Rodriguez from the State Environmental Lab and invited him to conduct an independent water quality assessment. He arrived the next day with equipment that cost more than Dexter's BMW and the kind of thoroughness that makes fake reports look like crayon drawings. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Rodriguez announced after 6 hours of testing, "this is some of the cleanest fresh water I've analyzed in Colorado. Your pond supports a textbook example of healthy aquatic ecosystem balance." His 20-page report systematically destroyed every claim in Linda Walsh's fabricated assessment. Where she claimed dangerous bacteria, he found beneficial microorganisms. Where she saw toxic algae, he documented native aquatic plants that improved water quality. But Dexter's desperation was escalating beyond bureaucratic corruption into outright sabotage. Someone, and security cameras would later confirm it was Dexter's brother-in-law, attempted to vandalize my flood monitoring equipment with a baseball bat and what appeared to be misdirected anger at technology in general. The trail camera footage was comedy gold, a middle-aged man in khakis swinging wildly at waterproof sensors while cursing about government surveillance and property rights. I learned something useful about security systems. Wireless trail cameras cost $60 and provide HD evidence of trespassing. Just make sure they're positioned on your own property where recording is completely legal. Meanwhile, my community education campaign was working better than expected. The smell of fear and fresh-baked cookies filled every town hall meeting as neighbors realized their houses sat in a natural flood zone that had been protected for 99 years. Mrs. Brighton, your beautiful garden sits exactly where Millbrook Creek used to overflow every spring, I explained, pointing to historical survey maps. My great-grandfather's dam has been protecting your property since 1924. The taste of impending justice mixed with morning coffee as more neighbors joined our safety coalition. But Dexter still had cards to play. His final bureaucratic gambit came through County Commissioner Bradley Walsh. Yes, another golf buddy, because apparently Dexter's social circle consisted entirely of officials who confused public service with personal profit. Walsh proposed Emergency Resolution 1247, declaring my dam a clear and present danger that required immediate removal for community safety. The resolution included language about emergency powers during natural disaster preparation. The resolution was scheduled for an emergency vote during the next county commission meeting, which Walsh had deliberately scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. when most working people couldn't attend. I showed up anyway, armed with Dr. Martinez's flood modeling, Dr. Rodriguez's water quality reports, and Harold Brighton's legal documentation proving the demolition would violate federal law. Commissioners, I said during public comment, I have scientific evidence that removing this dam will flood 47 houses during spring snowmelt season, which begins in 3 weeks. Walsh tried to interrupt. Mr. Blackwood, we appreciate your concerns, but Commissioner Walsh, I continued, I also have documentation showing that anyone who authorizes this demolition will be personally liable for millions of dollars in flood damage, plus federal penalties for destroying authorized infrastructure. You could watch the other commissioners physically distance themselves from Walsh as they realized he'd been setting them up for massive legal liability. The resolution failed 4-1, with Walsh as the only supporter of his own proposal. But Dexter had one last desperate card. If he couldn't destroy my dam legally, he'd do it illegally and claim it was an accident. County demolition equipment appeared at my property Friday morning with orders to begin emergency stabilization work on my structurally compromised dam. The crew chief claimed they were making emergency repairs to prevent catastrophic failure, emergency repairs that involved setting explosive charges. The sound of diesel engines and the smell of blasting powder told me that Dexter had finally abandoned any pretense of legality. He was going to destroy my dam and deal with the consequences later, probably betting that flood damage would distract from his criminal liability. Time to let physics be the judge. The emergency stabilization crew arrived at dawn with enough explosives to level a city block, which seemed excessive for routine maintenance on a 99-year-old dam that had never needed major repairs. I stood in my driveway sipping coffee that tasted like bitter irony, watching them position shaped charges with the kind of precision you'd use to demolish a building, not stabilize it. "Morning, gentlemen," I called to the crew chief. "Funny kind of stabilization work you're doing there." He avoided eye contact like a teenager caught shoplifting. "Orders are orders, sir. County says this structure needs immediate attention." What they didn't know was that I'd spent the previous night installing additional flood monitoring equipment throughout the neighborhood, not to prevent the disaster, but to document it in real time for the lawsuit that would follow. Every house in the potential flood zone now had water sensors in their basements, motion-activated cameras in their yards, and automatic text alerts that would trigger the moment water levels started rising. When Dexter's demolition caused flooding, I'd have minute-by-minute documentation of the damage. My phone buzzed with a text from Harold Brighton. Federal judge granted emergency stay, demolition illegal until Monday hearing. I walked over to the crew chief and handed him the court order. "Gentlemen, you'll want to read this before you accidentally commit a federal crime." His face went white as he realized they'd been about to violate a federal court injunction. The crew packed up faster than teenagers fleeing a house party when parents come home early. But Dexter wasn't done fighting dirty. That afternoon, I discovered someone had filed anonymous complaints with every regulatory agency in Colorado, claiming my dam violated environmental laws, safety regulations, zoning ordinances, and probably the Geneva Convention. EPA investigators, state environmental officers, county health inspectors, and federal wildlife officials all showed up within hours of each other, creating a bureaucratic traffic jam in my driveway that looked like a law enforcement convention. The irony was beautiful. Every investigation vindicated my dam while revealing more evidence of Dexter's corruption. The EPA confirmed my environmental permits were valid. State engineers verified the dam's structural integrity. Wildlife officials documented the healthy ecosystem my pond supported. But each investigation also revealed forged documents, falsified reports, and fraudulent complaints, all traceable back to Dexter and his network of corrupt officials. I learned something fascinating about government bureaucracy. Honest investigators hate being used by corrupt officials, and they tend to investigate the people who file obviously fraudulent complaints. Mr. Blackwood, EPA investigator Jennifer Walsh told me, someone has been systematically filing false environmental reports about your property. We're opening a criminal investigation into whoever's been wasting federal resources with fabricated complaints. The smell of investigation paperwork and the taste of vindication filled my kitchen as federal agents documented Dexter's attempt to weaponize environmental law against me. Meanwhile, the weather was not cooperating with anyone's timeline. Colorado's snowpack had reached 160% of normal levels, and meteorologists were predicting the earliest spring melt on record due to an unexpected warming trend. Ezra, Dr. Martinez called to update me, our models show peak snowmelt starting 2 weeks earlier than predicted. If that dam gets destroyed, flooding could begin within days instead of weeks. Time was running out for everyone, including the innocent families who lived downstream from Dexter's stupidity. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I was going to save my neighbors despite their attacks on me, because that's what engineers do. We solve problems, even when the problems are created by people who hate us. I called an emergency meeting of the Millbrook Safety Coalition and presented our final evacuation plan. Ladies and gentlemen, I said to the packed community center, Dexter is going to destroy my dam, whether it's legal or not. We can't stop him, but we can protect ourselves. The room fell silent, except for the sound of people breathing and the distant rumble of snowmelt already beginning in the mountains. I've prepared evacuation routes, temporary housing arrangements, and insurance documentation guides for every family in the flood zone. When my dam gets destroyed, you'll have 4 to 6 hours before the worst flooding hits. Janet Morrison stood up. Ezra, why are you helping us after everything we put you through? The question hung in the air like morning mist over my doomed pond. Because that's what my great-grandfather would have done, I said. He built that dam to protect this valley, not just our family. Some responsibilities are bigger than personal grudges. The taste of duty mixed with the metallic tang of approaching disaster as I distributed evacuation plans to families who'd spent months trying to destroy the only thing protecting them. But Dexter had one final desperate move. If he couldn't destroy my dam through legal channels, he'd make it look like an accident caused by natural structural failure. Sunday night, motion sensors triggered alerts showing figures moving around my dam in the darkness. Trail camera footage revealed Dexter's brother-in-law and 2 other men attempting to weaken the dam's foundation with sledgehammers and what appeared to be misplaced enthusiasm for amateur demolition. The sound of metal on stone echoed across the water as they tried to create natural weak points that would cause catastrophic failure during spring flooding. I called 911 and sheriff's deputies arrived to find 3 middle-aged men standing knee-deep in freezing creek water, holding sledgehammers and looking like they'd been caught robbing a bank. Officers, we were just checking for structural damage, Dexter's brother-in-law explained, somehow managing to sound guilty even when telling the truth about what they were doing. The deputies arrested all 3 for criminal trespassing and vandalism, but the damage was done. They'd weakened critical support points just enough to ensure the dam would fail during peak snowmelt. Monday morning's court hearing became irrelevant when my structural engineer confirmed that weekend sabotage had created genuine safety concerns. The dam was now actually dangerous, not because of age or design flaws, but because of deliberate sabotage. Your Honor, I told federal judge Patricia Morrison, the defendants have created the very safety hazard they claimed to be preventing. My dam is now genuinely unstable due to criminal sabotage. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and brutal. Emergency demolition would proceed under federal supervision to prevent catastrophic failure that could kill people downstream. Dexter had finally gotten his wish, but at the cost of criminal charges, federal investigation, and personal liability for everything that happened next. The irony was perfect. In his desperation to destroy my dam, he'd made its destruction inevitable while ensuring maximum legal consequences for himself. The federally supervised demolition began at 6 a.m. Tuesday, under gray skies that looked like they were rehearsing for the disaster to come. I stood on my front porch watching Army Corps of Engineers detonate a century of my family's craftsmanship, the controlled explosions echoing across the valley like thunder announcing the apocalypse. But Mother Nature, with her perfect sense of timing, decided not to wait for the official meteorological schedule. The first wave of snowmelt hit at 2 p.m., 6 hours earlier than Dr. Martinez's most aggressive predictions. I watched my great-grandfather's pond drain in minutes as 99 years of stored mountain water suddenly remembered what gravity meant. The creek, freed from a century of management, began rising with the enthusiasm of a teenager who'd just gotten car keys and a credit card. By 4 p.m., water was pooling in the lowest parts of Millbrook Estates. By 5 p.m., it was flowing down streets that had been designed without considering where water naturally wanted to go. My phone exploded with text alerts from flood sensors I'd installed throughout the neighborhood. Basement flooding detected at 47 Maple Drive. Water level rising at 23 Oak Street. Emergency evacuation recommended for 1200 Block Pine Avenue. The taste of vindication mixed with genuine concern for my neighbors as I watched physics deliver its final exam in real time. Dexter's $800,000 McMansion, built directly in the creek's original overflow channel, was the first to experience what my great-grandfather had understood a century earlier. Water always finds its way home. At 6 p.m., the Millbrook Community Center became an impromptu evacuation shelter and the venue for the most dramatic town hall meeting in Colorado history. 300 residents packed into a space designed for half that number, many arriving with muddy shoes and shell-shocked expressions. Local news crews had set up cameras to document what would become a textbook case study in how to destroy a community through stupidity and greed. I took the podium while rescue boats visible through the gymnasium windows provided a soundtrack of disaster response. Friends and neighbors, I began. 6 months ago, your HOA president claimed my family's dam was a safety hazard that needed immediate removal. Tonight, 47 of your homes are flooding because that dam is no longer there to protect you. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain beginning to fall, because apparently Colorado's weather had developed a sense of dramatic timing. Sheriff Maria Santos approached the podium with an arrest warrant that had been personally signed by the federal judge overseeing our case. "Mr. Dexter Hawthorne," she announced, "you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, environmental crimes, and criminal negligence resulting in property damage." Dexter, who'd been hiding in the back of the room wearing a baseball cap like a failed disguise, tried to slip out the emergency exit, but 300 angry homeowners make an effective citizen's arrest when properly motivated. "Going somewhere, Dexter?" Janet Morrison blocked his path with the determination of someone whose basement was currently hosting an unplanned swimming party. The handcuffs clicked shut while Channel 9's cameras captured every moment of his arrest during live coverage of the flood he'd caused. "Mr. Hawthorne," reporter Sarah Brighton asked, "do you have anything to say to the families whose homes are flooding because you destroyed their flood protection?" Dexter's response will probably be remembered in journalism textbooks. "This isn't my fault. Nobody could have predicted this." I held up my phone and played the recording of Dexter dismissing flood concerns as fear-mongering during his morning press conference 6 hours earlier. "Mr. Hawthorne, 3 different engineering reports warned you this flooding would happen. You chose to ignore science because it conflicted with your profit margins. Your ignorance doesn't qualify as a natural disaster." The crowd erupted in applause while Dexter was led away in handcuffs, his pressed khakis now muddy from wading through the same floodwater that was claiming his mansion. But the evening's justice wasn't finished. Federal prosecutor Janet Walsh, apparently not all the Walshes in Colorado were corrupt, arrived with criminal charges that read like a corruption enthusiast's greatest hits: embezzlement, fraud, bribery, environmental crimes, criminal negligence, and violation of federal flood control laws. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "Mr. Hawthorne's criminal enterprise has been under federal investigation for 6 months. His destruction of authorized flood control infrastructure was the final evidence we needed for federal prosecution." State Attorney General Rebecca Martinez followed with civil charges that would make Dexter personally liable for every dollar of flood damage, an amount that insurance investigators were already estimating at over $8 million. Mr. Hawthorne will be financially responsible for repairing every flooded home, replacing every damaged possession, and compensating every displaced family, she announced while water continued rising outside. The crowd's cheers mixed with the sound of rescue boats and emergency sirens, creating Colorado's most expensive lesson in why you don't ignore engineers. As if the universe wanted to add punctuation to the evening's justice, County Inspector Rick Morrison arrived in handcuffs, arrested for filing fraudulent safety reports and accepting bribes. Turns out, Sheriff Santos announced, when you fabricate government documents, the FBI takes that personally. The final touch came when Dr. Martinez presented the Army Corps of Engineers with plans for rebuilding my dam to modern federal flood control standards, funded by federal disaster relief grants and Dexter's personal bankruptcy settlement. The new dam will protect this community for the next 500 years, she announced, assuming future HOA presidents remember that physics doesn't negotiate with property values. Environmental lawyer Rebecca Torres had one final surprise: federal charges against everyone who'd participated in the conspiracy to destroy authorized infrastructure. 3 county commissioners, 2 inspectors, 1 city councilman, and Dexter's brother-in-law all faced federal prosecution for their roles in what would become known as the Millbrook disaster. As rescue boats continued evacuating families from the neighborhood that had spent months trying to destroy their only protection, I realized that sometimes justice arrives exactly when you need it most, delivered by the same natural forces that corrupt officials think they can ignore. The sweet taste of vindication mixed with mountain rain as I watched a century of engineering wisdom prove itself one final time, even in destruction. 6 months later, Millbrook Estates looked like a completely different place. And not just because half the McMansions had been replaced with flood-resistant architecture that actually respected where water wanted to go. The flood damage totaled $8.2 million across 47 homes, every penny of which came out of Dexter's personal assets, various insurance policies, and a federal disaster relief fund specifically created for corruption-induced natural disasters. Turns out the government has a budget category for every kind of stupidity, including man-made flooding caused by destroying century-old infrastructure. Dexter himself was experiencing the federal justice system's hospitality at a minimum security facility in Kansas, serving 18 months for embezzlement plus 5 years for criminal negligence resulting in property damage. His sentence included $1.2 million in restitution payments and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in America. Apparently, when you steal community funds to destroy flood protection, federal judges lose their sense of humor about property rights activism. The new dam was a thing of beauty, engineered to modern Army Corps standards, but built with limestone quarried from the same Colorado mountains my great-grandfather had used. Federal flood control grants covered the $2.4 million construction cost, turning my family's legacy into a federally protected historic landmark that would control flooding for the next 5 centuries. My sustainable farming business was thriving with community support that felt like redemption mixed with the smell of fresh-cut hay and the sound of water flowing over precisely engineered spillways. The 3-acre pond was teeming with trout that people actually paid to catch now, and my organic vegetable operation supplied half the restaurants in town. But the real healing came through community rebuilding. The reformed Millbrook Estates HOA, now led by Janet Morrison with transparency requirements that would make the Securities and Exchange Commission proud, voted unanimously to establish the Blackwood Flood Safety Scholarship for engineering students studying watershed management. The annual Millbrook Watershed Festival had become a regional celebration of environmental conservation and community resilience. Local breweries competed to create the best damn good decision beer, with proceeds supporting flood control education programs. Kids who'd grown up thinking HOAs were all-powerful learned that physics beats politics, engineering trumps ignorance, and sometimes the guy everyone thinks is crazy turns out to be the only one paying attention to reality. The smell of barbecue smoke mixed with mountain air as 3,000 visitors celebrated the 3rd annual festival around the pond that had caused so much trouble and provided so much protection. My ex-wife Sarah had moved back to help manage the expanded aquaculture operation, realizing that fighting for something meaningful beats fighting over divorce settlements. We weren't remarried, but we were rebuilding something stronger than what we'd lost. The historical marker erected by the Colorado Historical Society read, Samuel Blackwood Dam, built 1924, destroyed 2024, rebuilt 2025. A testament to the enduring wisdom that water always remembers where it belongs. The Army Corps of Engineers had adopted my great-grandfather's original design techniques for modern flood control projects across the Rocky Mountain region. The new dam now protected 15,000 people in an expanded flood control zone that included 3 downstream communities. Water management consulting had become my full-time profession, protecting communities across Colorado from officials who thought engineering advice was optional. 12 other towns had hired me to audit their flood control infrastructure and educate local governments about the difference between political authority and physical reality. One final piece of justice. County Inspector Rick Morrison was working construction after losing his professional licenses and serving 6 months for falsifying government documents. The sweet taste of karma mixed with morning coffee as I watched him follow engineering specifications without argument. Prison had apparently taught him the value of professional competence. As I sat on my front porch every morning, listening to water flow over limestone that would outlast everyone who'd tried to destroy it, I remembered something my great-grandfather had written in his 1924 construction notes. Build for the floods you haven't seen yet, because water doesn't care about your schedule, your budget, or your politics. It only cares about gravity. Some wisdom transcends generations, especially when it's carved in stone and tested by time. Remember, corrupt officials count on public ignorance to enable their schemes. One person armed with facts, a video camera, and enough stubborn determination can protect an entire community from institutional stupidity. Hit subscribe and ring that notification bell because corrupt officials are everywhere and the best way to fight them is by sharing their stories until they can't hide anymore. And drop your worst HOA power trip story in the comments below. I read every single one, and the most outrageous stories become future episodes. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's preventing the next disaster by making sure everyone knows how the last one happened.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.